Welcome to the Top of the Stack podcast by RisingStack, where we share stories on building great products with excellent engineers. The aim of the show is to discuss architectural design, development trends, and best practices for creating resilient applications. For our new listeners, RisingStack is a software development and consulting company based in Budapest. We are passionate about full-stack JavaScript with strong preferences for node.js, microservices, and DevOps. To learn more about us, check out RisingStack.com. For more content, blog.risingstack.com. You can also find us on Twitter, and feel free to reach out for development advice.
I'm Csaba Balog, your host, sitting with our co-host Tamás Kadlecik, CEO of RisingStack.
Hello, I'm Tamás, glad to be here today.
Today we are going to talk about the architecture of N26, a successful German startup company. N26 is a mobile banking platform where customers can do everything a traditional bank does, except easier and from anywhere in the world. Services include basic banking transactions, cashing from any ATM without fees, instant account management and security, and receiving real-time notifications about your account activity. N26's main markets are Germany, Austria, France, Spain, and Italy, and currently has over 500,000 users. Our guest today is Patrick Kua, CTO of N26. Welcome, Patrick. We are super happy you are here today and you could make it.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I'm also very excited to sort of share the story of behind the scenes at N26. I think it's an exciting tech company. Even though I've only been here for 3 months, I'm excited to share some of the behind the scenes part of what makes a mobile bank successful.
Okay, let's dive into our conversation, shall we? Could you tell us, Patrick, a bit more about your background and how you become a part of N26?
Sure, yeah. My story is kind of interesting because I've been actually doing consulting for the last 13 and a half years with a sort of consulting firm called ThoughtWorks. So many of you may have heard of ThoughtWorks.
Yeah.
The chief scientist at ThoughtWorks was Martin Fowler. And there's a lot of sort of excitement around ThoughtWorks where it was very proud about pushing sort of new ideas and new technologies into the industry. So I think probably one of the biggest shifts was the introduction of continuous delivery, which came out of ThoughtWorks. And I'm really sort of honored to have worked alongside some of the people who contributed to those ideas. I guess I've actually quite a new joiner to N26. So I've now been there for 3 months. And they actually approached me to take on sort of this role of CTO. And I thought it was quite exciting after doing quite a lot of consulting for quite some time across lots of different industries, including banking, finance, insurance, amongst many others, to actually have some responsibility. So I think from my perspective as a consultant, you add a lot of value by bringing in new ideas and new approaches. At the same time, you sort of end up being a little bit frustrated because you always rely on sort of influencing people, trying to convince people to take on some of these choices that you hope will have a much more positive impact. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons I took on this role as a CTO, is that I was really excited to meet some of the technologists, engineers, infrastructure people behind the scenes, and was already impressed by the technology and sort of services that they've developed. And I really wanted to sort of help them build on that sort of base platform and sort of lead the way around building an amazing product, which is growing and growing. So I think you mentioned we had 500,000 users. So over the 3 months that I've been there, we've actually sort of gone to 200,000 more. So we're now over 700,000 users across Europe. And there's lots of exciting sort of opportunities around how we grow. And I think for me, joining the company, this is an exciting opportunity because so one of the challenges that I used to consult in was really helping organizations scale. And I think it's exciting to be alongside a company as it scales and grows and being able to support that really key engineering culture.
When it comes to microservices, Martin Fowler is a name that you really cannot really go around. Did you work with him personally?
Yeah, so in ThoughtWorks, Martin Fowler does a lot of visiting. So I think he's very humble in that he talks about how he's actually not the person who has a lot of the ideas. And over the 13 and a half years, I've actually had to I've been lucky enough to spend time with Martin across lots of different types of situations. So both in internal meetings about the tech radar that ThoughtWorks publishes a couple of times a year, but also consulting with clients. And I've even had the joy of actually having Martin Fowler on site, where he was able to talk to other sort of technologists. And he's very kind as well in terms of actually offering his platform. So here's martinfowler.com, and the sort of readership with that, in that he can also publish other articles. So I've published a couple of other articles out there, and I think it's a really generous sort of platform that Martin gives.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we started out with microservices, we learned most of the things from his blog. So, yeah, thank you.
Patrick, can you tell us a bit more about the main languages you use for developing and N26?
Sure. So N26 is kind of made up of obviously being a mobile application. We're actually native on both platforms. So this means that naturally we operate in Swift on sort of the iOS platform. And then mostly at the moment Java, but sort of more and more Kotlin, which is being adopted by the Android sort of team. In the sort of backend services and internal applications, JavaScript is obviously one of the key languages in there, being sort of web app based for some of the internal sort of applications. But the most of the backend services were actually based on the sort of Java platform. We have had an experiment which the team has concluded we didn't want to continue down, which was really around Scala. And we also have a sort of backend experiment around TypeScript, but we had decided not to sort of go down that path. At the moment, we're actually currently exploring Kotlin as to towards moving towards a more modern JVM-based language. Obviously, Java 9 is coming out at some point, and we'll sort of, that would have been a natural candidate. But I think we're also interested to see how Kotlin will develop, given its sort of warm embrace by Google around the Android platform.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why you ditched Scala and what you like about Kotlin?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things with Scala, and I've seen this, and this is my own personal opinion as well, is that there's a lot of complexity in Scala. So I think one of the interesting things about Scala is that it maybe opens up too many options for people. So for me, it's not really much of an opinionated language. And as a consequence, you end up with an interesting social problem amongst developers of having a certain complexity of not knowing which way to be able to do things. So in a way, it kind of reminds me of the day of when there was a lot of Perl being written, and that there's many, many different ways of actually doing that. You sort of see this in the sort of JavaScript community to a certain degree, and that there's many different ways of approaching the same sort of problems. And Scala has that sort of complexity in there. And so you can write very terse, and I would say sometimes obscure Scala code if you're a very powerful Scala user, but that obviously diminishes readability for other people who are maybe beginning to learn the language. I think what's really interesting from my perspective, and what the team is exploring as we sort of experiment with Kotlin in sort of smaller areas, is actually this kind of simplicity about the language that Kotlin has. So I'm a big fan of IntelliJ since its inception when it was published many, many years ago. And I've been very impressed behind the pragmatism, I think, of the JetBrains team. And I think that pragmatism really comes across the language of Kotlin around, something that helps you get on with the task that you need to do and gets out of your way to do it. So in a certain way, I think they've been really focused on the sort of ease of use, which really shines in their sort of IDE IntelliJ. And I think I'm really intrigued to see how that will sort of continue to evolve in Kotlin. And I think this is one of the reasons that we as a team at N26 are actually moving towards Kotlin more so than Scala, and definitely not to Scala, but more towards Kotlin.
As you mentioned, JavaScript has this kind of same kind of complexity and a lot of ways to go when it comes to development. So why did you decide to use it on the back end in that case?
So I don't actually have the context as to why JavaScript was picked on the back end from that area. I think, so we use Node for one of our internal applications, and I think one of the reasons is that it's a sort of full stack team who sort of own everything from end to end. and they were a lot more comfortable sort of working in sort of JavaScript. I think the reason that it's a sort of web app based system, it doesn't actually maintain a lot of state. It's actually a lot more point to point talking to other sort of RESTful endpoints. And so from that perspective, it kind of made sense to sort of move in that sort of direction for that team. At least that's what I believe. And I think from that sort of team, the feedback is it's been pretty happy from that perspective. Obviously, we don't have the challenge of everyone having to maintain the same sort of code. It's really belonging to that sort of team. So I think from that perspective, it's kind of the language that they're most comfortable with, most proficient, and they're happy to sort of maintain it, and hasn't really led to a lot of unnecessary complexity.
Thank you.
What databases do you operate with, and for what purposes at N26?
We're actually surprisingly very ordinary. So I think it's interesting here because I think what I really like about the technology team is that we've picked very sort of simple tools that are very well known, that are very stable, and that lets us focus on actually solving the problem of how do we build a bank that the world loves to use, and focus on really speed around that sort of space. So I think what's interesting about our stack, and particularly databases, is that it's nothing particularly special at the moment. So we have a combination of both MySQL and sort of Postgres databases. The MySQL is mostly used for a lot of the applications and services. The Postgres database was used a lot for sort of reporting purposes, but we're actually moving away from that to Redshift for our data warehouse. So I think it's kind of interesting because we haven't really got very specialized around our sort of storage yet, but it does what we need to do, and it scales for what we need right now.
What communication protocols do you use between your services?
So we're a set of sort of microservices. Most of the time, a lot of the services are actually sort of RESTful endpoints for sort of more synchronous communication. And then we actually have a bunch of sort of asynchronous communications using sort of queuing via SQS. And they're the kind of two protocols that we're kind of mostly using. There's a couple of specialized protocols because of sort of payments, but they're the two main ones that most of our services use.
Can you tell us a bit more, how do you handle testing, and what kind of tests do you have in place right now?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting in our sort of environment, because I think I was very surprised when I joined. And I think it's impressive for a bank as well, is that I think the level of automation is much higher than what I've seen in a lot of other more traditional banks. And I think that allows us actually to move very quickly. So we have pretty much standard kind of types of automation tests. So every team is expected to be writing sort of unit and integration tests. Where we do a lot more integration with sort of partners, I think we rely a lot more on sort of integration tests against their APIs, because I think with any sort of partner, what's written down in a specification is often not quite how a system behaves. So we get a lot better feedback through those levels of tests. We also have sort of end-to-end automation tests. We're getting a little bit better at some of our end-to-end, including the full mobile applications. So we're sort of developing suites that are testing the entire set of microservices, plus the sort of front end. And we also have a number of tests around our sort of deployment as well. So we have a very strong automation, continuous deployment or delivery pipeline. And as part of that, we also do tests when we deploy to make sure that things work well before we actually sort of roll it out to customers. And that's how we really maintain scalability and quality for our end users in mind.
These tests you run to make sure everything works fine when you deploy your services, do you couple those with deployment strategies such as red, black, or canary or something like that?
Yeah, so as part of a continuous sort of delivery pipeline, we have what we call a golden server, which is the equivalent of a kind of canary. So that would be one of our sort of steps. So if you imagine a pipeline, a service typically goes through its sort of normal unit testing. We have also security testing automation in place to check for common vulnerabilities patterns. And then we sort of package everything up into a deployable. And then that gets shipped through different types of sort of testing environments. So more rigor around sort of integration and sort of acceptance testing environments. And then before it actually gets released, then it goes into what we call a golden server, which is our sort of first test. So if that sort of works well, then we'll slowly sort of roll that out. And then we have a sort of blue-green process where all the services will be upgraded in one sort of area before we switch over traffic. And then the rest of the servers would be updated with that sort of deployable.
Wow, I think a lot of people dream about having this kind of automation in place, and yeah, quite often we have clients coming to us to put some automation in place for them, but usually when we tell them about all these things, they just kind of recoil from the idea of spending so much time on DevOps. But yeah, it's definitely impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can't really take any credit for this because I think the team has already been working on this for quite some time. And what I'm really proud of is that the team had that sort of idea about investment in automation very early on, and I see it really paying back because it means that when we actually release and we release hundreds of times per week, that's pretty exciting for us to be able to do that with safety in mind. And knowing that we'll be able to provide a good quality service as a digital bank and a modern digital bank for people. And when I think about some of the probably same situation in your sort of with your clients and when I was doing consulting as well, it's scary to think about how traditional banks do things where release cycles are sort of in the order of maybe 3 months at a earliest versus 9 even longer when you think about end-to-end release cycles. And it's a really exciting place for people to work when we think about what's possible with that right direction and the right level of automation done very early on.
Do you use any specific CI tools?
So we use Jenkins as our sort of main orchestrator. But other than that, we don't use any sort of special CI tools on top of that. Obviously, the deployment and the entire pipeline is made through that. We also use, I guess, the Jenkins as code sort of. So this is about really the, it's easy with Jenkins to be able to click and configure everything. But for us, we've taken automation and source control and the idea of continuous delivery to heart, where our infrastructure is very much source controlled and managed that way as well, and so is our sort of continuous delivery pipeline, which in a lot of places is another single point of failure. But for us, it's all sort of source controlled and managed that way.
Cool. You said that you use SQS for queues. Am I right to assume that you have your services deployed on AWS?
Yeah, we are in the cloud for some of our services. Yes, we are.
I see, but not all of them then.
Yeah, there's a couple of constraints where we need not virtual servers, but yes, most of our services are in the cloud.
I see. And on naked EC2 machines, or you use, I don't know, ECS or Elastic Beanstalk or something like that on AWS?
That's a level of detail I haven't quite got to with our sort of operations group, so I wouldn't be able to say.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Did you face any scaling problems in your current architecture? And if you did, how did you solve it?
At the moment, our sort of architecture is quite scalable. So we haven't really faced any internal scaling challenges. I think what's interesting is that we have a number of products that we've partnered with other companies for. And unfortunately, we have sort of hit scaling problems with some of their external integrations. So I think you were, from what I understood, kind of fairly impressed by the level of automation and sort of CD, processes that we have in place. And unfortunately, some of our partners don't have the same level of that. So sometimes, the only place that we can actually do the sort of test is actually with test accounts in sort of environments, because partners haven't quite got the same level of rigor that we want. We're trying to work with them on that. But I would say that's probably more the some of the scaling challenges that we have, is making sure that our partners have the same level of quality that we expect and sort of demand from our own internal services.
How do you prevent errors from cascading between your services?
So at the moment, we have sort of timeouts and retries as part of that. We haven't got to any sort of level of distributed tracing yet. And I think one of the reasons is that we have really, really excellent monitoring as well. So for us, the user experience is really key to both the application. So in terms of how users use the application and the focus we have on design and usability. But that also translates into a really relentless focus on making sure that we know about when users are starting to have errors before they do, and having very good monitoring on that. So I guess when we are starting to detect errors, we have a lot of information on all sorts of endpoints to be able to know when things don't look right. And then teams are very quick at actually responding to that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the timeouts you use? Because, it can be problematic if you just use simple static timeouts, and then longer queries cannot be served properly. So how do you go around that?
So I don't know the exact details because we have quite a lot of different services, and it's more sort of up to the tech leads per team to make sure that actually happens. It's kind of a level of detail I wouldn't be able to honestly say, but I know that we do have some level of timeouts and retries for each team and service.
I see. And do you use caching between services? And so when it comes to these infrastructural elements, I would like to just list some. So caching between services or circuit breakers, and do you make sure that side effects are kept idempotent between services?
Yeah, so for us, obviously transactions are quite important about idempotency. That's always a really hard word to say. And we make sure that that is, when things are repeated, that they can't be double booked from that perspective. Also, it really kind of depends on the types of services that you're talking about. So we have, I think, caching around some of the more static type of informations, so that there's no sort of consequence on that. I think we use Hystrix as well in terms of the some of the tooling around the sort of retry and circuit breaking, but I'm not really sure how consistently that's used across all the services yet. I think all the tech leads make sure that there's responsible amounts of timeouts and sort of retries around that, but I don't think it makes sense from our platform to really standardize on one thing for all services, because for us, it really depends on the types of characteristics per service. So there are some services that are obviously less used because they're more references to static data. And then there are other services such as transactions, which are super high throughput, where we really need to make sure that they work, and idempotency is very, very key for that.
I see. And can you tell us a little bit of details about how idempotency is ensured, where it has to be?
Yeah, so I think it's basically whenever you actually book a transaction and you sort of move money, these are things that for us are really key elements of idempotency. So obviously, if something fails to get booked, then we don't want to double book that. And for us, that's probably the real key part of sort of moving money around, which is like the heart of banking, really.
I see. Thanks.
We at RisingStack take it very seriously to keep up with new technologies, and we are very excited about it. What's coming next? So we would be very glad if you could share what specific technologies you are looking forward to in 2018 and looking forward to implement at N26.
Yeah, so I think what's really exciting about the base platform that we have is that it's already what I would consider quite mature from a continuous delivery perspective, and I think for us, security is a really key thing that we're really trying to weave in. So there's a movement which is sort of beyond DevOps, but really DevSecOps, and this is really about the way that we can actually bring in sort of more automation, more sort of security checking into place and weave that into the entire development process. So I think that as a general movement is a really exciting place to be. I think you have to have already really good DevOps and good continuous delivery processes to get to that next level. And I think for us, that's a really exciting place to be. because I think we have those base fundamentals. That means that we're actually have a really good opportunity to weave security in more continuously and lead the edge in that sort of way. I think hand in hand with that sort of stuff, there's also a field that kind of goes along with sort of continuous delivery. And then what works well for banking is actually about the idea about continuous compliance. So I think one of the interesting thing about working at a bank is regulations and reporting. And I think this is actually something that continuous delivery does really help, which is like when you have builds, you have a lot of strong traceability about the reports and the information that come out of that. And I think from us, moving towards so continuous compliance is a really great way of being able to understand how do we extract or keep track of the information from our builds and our continuous delivery pipeline that proves that we are continually compliant. And so there's a tool that we're sort of looking at, which is called DevSec. IO, I think, is the website, and they're really a tool that is around sort of hardening of services. But what's really interesting is the way that they've also built it, which is sort of using BDT style scenarios. So that means that you get really good documentation about the tests that you run against your servers to make sure that you can actually tie it back to the purpose of the test and the regulation. And then you get automated reporting as part of that. So I think we have a really good basis that I'm excited that we're going to be trying to move towards for 2018. And then the other side is really around sort of the chaos engineering and sort of chaos testing side. So reliability for us is also another key aspect of being a bank, of being continually available. And I think with a lot of more traditional banks, and I've seen this happen a lot, is that they may plan one test a year of where they manually test sort of a DR sort of activation. And I think for us, we're in a really good spot again to be able to start moving towards experimenting with some of the sort of chaos testing tools that are out there. So I guess the Chaos Monkey from Netflix and some of the other types of tools that are coming out there to be able to help us build resiliency and reliability from the get-go, and making sure that each service that we build really has that aspect in mind. So I think for me, they're the two kind of trends that I'm really excited that we're going to be taking our company on in N26. Both, I feel, add a lot of value to our users, both in terms of safety and reliability, and allow us to really focus on then the product once we have them part of our normal sort of development process.
I cannot help but ask two questions still. One of them is whenever I mention Chaos Monkey, anybody, they just lose their minds, and everybody is saying, no, we're not ready for that yet. And nobody ever feels they're ready for Chaos Monkey. So was it difficult to convince people to go that way and, I don't know, look into Chaos Monkey even?
So we're still on that journey. So I think people are really keen and eager for that. I think that's the interesting thing at N26 is that everyone is very pragmatic. So I don't think it's Chaos Monkey for the sake of it, but I think everyone is behind the ideas of that we have to prove ourselves to be resilient and constantly available, and therefore something like the chaos engineering tool set really make a lot of big difference. I think everyone also is really bought into the sort of agile mindset of starting small, learning from that. And the more that you sort of test and break a system, then the more resilient and stronger it gets. So I think I'm kind of lucky in that I didn't actually have to do a lot of convincing. I think people are maybe a bit cautious about how we will sort of roll this out. But I think everyone is keen to actually give it a go because I think it's a really exciting field to be in. And B, adds a lot of value for our users who we are building software for. So I think both of those things are really exciting to be an engineer at sort of N26 from that perspective.
Well, that's really great. The other one I wanted to ask you is that you mentioned that the business requirements and regulations change quickly when it comes to banking. And I couldn't help but think of Richard Rogers' book, The Tao of Microservices. I don't know if you read it or not yet, but...
No.
Pardon? Sorry?
Not yet. I haven't read it yet. No.
I see. Well, the main argument he has is you want to have your microservices as cattle and not paths. So practically, you want to have throwaway microservices, and when there's a new regulation or a new business requirement, you just plug in a new service to handle that, or throw away an old one and create a new one from scratch, because they should be so small and so quick to develop that it shouldn't be a problem. Do you follow anything like that?
So I think in principle, yes. I think the small size of microservices should be rewritable. I think there's a question about how small is small, which is always, I think, a constant raging battle in the microservices world. I think what's interesting, if I bring it back to the question about regulation, is that I think, like all things, it depends, because there are some regulations that are really cross-cutting across all types of domain areas. So the latest one is really about GDPR. So this is about data protection in EU, and the right for certain privacy. And I think this is an interesting one because you could argue that you could contain all information recorded about a person into a single place of your system. But actually that may not be what is important for how your business kind of works. So you'll often have like your customer view from a sort of customer services perspective, but then you also have your sort of account view of what that customer has registered with. And there's always that tension between putting all of that into a single place, which means that you'll naturally have a bigger service to have to replace, or distributing that, and then having to work out what thing is affected by the regulation. So I think from that perspective, I don't think there's an easy answer to say you can put all things into a single service and you will be able to easily replace that to comply with regulation, because it really comes down to what it is that you need to be compliant with and understanding the impact across your domain. And there will be some things that will cut across all things, and some of them that will be a lot more isolated. And I think what really matters is actually a lot more of this awareness about why the regulation is there, rather than simply following what often happens is you have to do this implementation because rule such and such says, without thinking about what the intent behind that is.
Yeah, definitely. Thinking only about the architecture and technologies and not how the domain affects it altogether, is I think quite a common mistake when somebody starts it with a new field, and with a new field where they develop software for. So
Thank you very much, Patrick, for sharing your insights with us today and telling more about your role, what you play at N26. It was great to hear how your system is built and where you're going. So thanks a lot for your time today.
Great, thank you very much for the for having me on your sort of podcast. I really enjoyed sharing the stories here at N26, and thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Top of the Stack. If you would like to learn more about Node.js and architecture design, just hit blog.risingstack.com for more awesome resources. Stay tuned for our upcoming content. Thanks for listening. See you on the next episode.